Hello everyone. Welcome back to Apollo's Arrow. In this episode we will be discussing the life of Italian philosopher and traditionalist, Julius Evola. Before continuing with the series about his teachings, we thought that would be of interest and help contextualize a short recap of Evola's life and his major intellectual influences. If you like this type of content, help Apollo's Arrow grow by subscribing, liking and commenting below the video. Julius Cesare Evola was born in a small aristocratic family of Sicilian origin, in Rome, on May 19, 1898. He was often referred to by the title Baron. Very little is known about his childhood, and it is probably of little interest to know. Evola at the appointed time began his engineering studies, which he never finished, although very close to the end, because he did not want to be attached in any way to the recognition of the titles of the academic bourgeoisie, such as doctor or engineer. His initial influences are related to the artistic currents of the time, such as Futurism and then Dadaism, where Evola became one of its most important artistic and theoretical exponent. His talent of painting and poetry brought him close to the writings of the decadents and well-known aesthetes of the time, such as Oscar Wilde and Gabriele D'Annunzio, who served as an introduction to the thought of Nietzsche and Otto Weininger. Their influences in the artistic aspect appear in the Dadaist beliefs that only the inner life of the individual has value to be reflected in an object of art. His life is also affected by the experiences of the Great World Wars, in which he had the opportunity to serve only in the first, while in the second, due to constant attacks on the bureaucracy and the spiritual poverty of the fascist state, he was not allowed to participate, although to reach an agreement he received the membership card of the fascist party, which he had always refused. After the Second War, his existence was forever marked by the fact of a dramatic experience that resulted in the limitation of his physical abilities until the end of his life. During his stay in Germany at the end of the war, Evola had a habit of walking around the city during the Allied bombings, to test his destiny, and this resulted in a paralyzing stroke from the waist down. The post-war period also had its complications regarding the Roman thinker, who was judged as a reactionary and instigator for the recreation of the fascist party. After 6 months in prison, Evola was declared innocent, influencing the clearing of his image through the reading in the hall, and then the publication of the article on Self-Defense, 1951, in which he explains his theoretical and political position before and after the war. His intellectual activity remained high until the end of his life, publishing a total of 36 books and 1,100 articles. Evola died on June 11, 1974, unmarried and childless. It is of interest to trace the thread of Evola's intellectual influences so that a greater understanding of his often contradictory and controversial philosophical positions may unfold. The first we will look at is Carlo Mittelstaedter, 1887 to 1910, whose influence on Evola is even higher than that of Nietzsche. Mittelstaedter was an Italian philosopher of Jewish origin who is known for his work Persuasion and Rhetoric. Convinced that he had nothing of value to add to his work, he decided one night to shoot himself to death. The main issue addressed by Mittelstaedter is the need for persuasion, but by which he understood the absolute self-sufficiency of the self. Rhetoric is only concerned with what comes from outside, while persuasion must necessarily originate from the main principle of the individual, which is the self. Thus value is found only in that which exists for itself, which seeks the principle of inner life from nothing and no one. This is autarky. On the other hand, The path of persuasion does not surrender to accepting what is given by others. Nietzsche is another thinker who has left an indelible mark on Evola's thought and work. The transvaluator of all values was included by Evola in the list of the wholly damned who were permeated by a spiritual current that led to their final consumption because, according to him, they lacked the supernormal self-realization centered in transcendence. The element of overcoming man in an earthly immanence appears clearly in Evola, who again criticizes in Nietzsche the lack of a transcendent dimension, perhaps due to a misunderstanding between this dimension as such and its attachment to religion, which he attacked. This in the work of the Roman thinker will be completed and applied in almost all the fields treated by him as a fundamental principle in the form of immanent transcendence. The third thinker of interest to be mentioned in the list of those who influenced Evola is Otto Weininger in relation to the treatment of the issue of the Evolian conception of the relationship between the sexes. Weininger is known for the work Sex and Character published in 1903. Sex and Character argues that all humans are a mixture of masculine and feminine elements and tries to support this thesis scientifically. Weininger's effort is notable because he uses Kantian methods to conduct a study of the central aspects in the work such as sex and character, and their manifestation in males and females. Weininger's interesting approach relates to the study of man and woman by elevating them to Platonic ideas such as absolute man and absolute woman to further his conclusions. This approach is also the most influential part of Evola's conception regarding the issue of sex, but which he completes by supporting his thesis of the superiority of men over women, with elements taken from the mythology and knowledge of ancient or traditional civilizations. In his opinion, man and woman reflect symbols of metaphysical proportions and are therefore predestined to be positioned in a well-defined hierarchy in relation to each other. Likewise, thinkers who have left their mark on Evola are the French psychologist and sociologist Gustave Le Bon with his works on the psychology of the masses and the people. Evola's conception of the people as formless matter that must be shaped by a state directed by powerful characters is a direct influence of Le Bon's thought, which argues that great civilizations are created precisely by a spiritual and mental elite. The well-known historian and philosopher Oswald Spengler, with his theory of the life of civilizations as organisms with birth, development, and death, is reflected in the Evolian conception of emphasizing epochs and civilizations with certain spiritual charges, extinguishing the idea of a continuous progress. His major influences, which mark the two turning points in Evola's intellectual activity, is Italian idealism and neo-idealism, which marked the entry into the philosophical debate of the time dominated by Benedetto Croce and Giovanni Gentile, as well as the traditionalism of René Guénon. A brief mention of Evola's philosophical works is of interest here. Evola's attempt was to reform Italian neo-idealism, from a philosophy of the absolute spirit to one of the absolute individual. The figure of Stirner with his anarchist conception of the individual and the ego permeates the Evolian philosophical work. He thus developed the doctrine of magical idealism, a term borrowed from Novalis. Evola's main position in the works of the idealist period is that the ego must understand that everything that appears as a reality independent of it is nothing but an illusion, caused by its privations. The Evolian system culminates in the conceptualization of the absolute individual, which must be understood as indivisible and free, that is, unlimited and unconditional freedom and power. He emphasizes the active element through magical idealism, criticizing the academic and speculative immanence of the philosophy of the time. The third moment, after the artistic and philosophical one, and perhaps the most important, is that regarding traditionalism. Meeting and getting to know René Guénon's work is the decisive moment in the ripening of Evola's thought. The category of tradition is established as the meaningful background of the entire worldview of the Roman thinker, slightly diluting his previous position of the absolute individual, but only in terms of his absolute autonomy. In fact, with the intervention of the category of tradition, the absolute individual, the absolute person, the man of tradition, the differentiated man for Evola, are not abolished and objectified in relation to this supernatural dimension, but are strengthened in so far as their possibility of transcending towards higher states, higher levels of being, lies concretely in the reality of tradition. His greatest influence has spread through the work of the traditional period, extending also to the field of politics, Eastern esoteric and philosophical thought, etc. It is of interest to immediately move on to mentioning some of the works with an esoteric character in general, for which Evola has received international recognition. The Hermetic Tradition, 1931, The Mystery of the Grail, 1937, The Doctrine of Awakening, 1943, The Yoga of Power, 1949, are the main works with a central theme or doctrine of Western or Eastern esoteric knowledge. The erudition of the Roman thinker in these fields is directly related to his interest in finding the practical and active element that would serve to overcome the speculative idealism of the time. Alchemy is the science of transmutations, the magical symbolism of the Grail as a center of power and immutability, surrounded by its own esoteric and mystical dimension, the doctrine of Buddhist asceticism, and Tantric Yoga as a discipline theoretical practical that sees the world as power, are treated densely and competently by Evola. The esoteric plane runs through the whole range of Evolian thought, and this can be easily understood if we do not forget that it speaks to a select few, who will spontaneously feel inclined to reach this hidden dimension. Evola's fate in the contemporary world has its own ambiguities. As we said, he continued his intellectual activity undisturbed, refusing any compromise in relation to his convictions and the time in which he lived. Official academia simply dismissed him as a totalitarian thinker, despite clarifying his implications with pre-war totalitarian regimes. Interest in Evola's thought, however, has been widespread in Italy, by readers and researchers, although not studied and read by official academic centers, but with the intention of criticizing him in advance, often expressing a lack of understanding of his work. The post-Berlin Wall period shows an increase in interest in Evola's work, especially that part of it with a traditional and esoteric character. This is shown by the interest of the American reader, which is also seen through the citation of the English editions of the works in this script. In Europe, the attraction to his political ideas has been growing, especially with the loss of the exclusivity of the left to resist the bourgeoisie and Western liberalism. Right-wing parties and movements in Europe, the USA and Russia show the influence of Evola, through the publication of his works or the use of concepts by political philosophers such as Alain de Benoist, founder of the French New Right, or Alexander Dugin, the creator of the Fourth Political Theory. Well-known thinkers in philosophy and political science have expressed similar interests and criticisms to Evola. Eric Voegelin is one of the political thinkers who expresses his criticism against secularization and the need for a new openness to the transcendent for enabling a new order of modern societies. Voegelin's position is clearly expressed in the opinion that God and man, the world and society, form a primordial community of being. Community is a given of experience insofar as it is known by man by virtue of his participation in the mystery of being. Despite the systematic and conceptual differences between Evola and Voegelin, In their works they agree on the chaotic nature of modernity and that the solution lies in openness to the transcendent. Hannah Arendt, with her insistence on the need for tradition and authority united by religion as continuity, marks her critique of secular political modernity and especially brings it closer to the Evolian position of authority as an ontological necessity to determine, or rather, make possible the self-determination of the Rex. Leo Strauss, with his work on the esoteric and exoteric dimensions of textual writing and its intelligibility, approaches Evola's position in what he calls the traditional method, which functions as the analogical apparatus of the essence. The application of the method to the mystery of the Grail shows that beyond the surface structures of legends, myths, symbols, or ideas in general, the similar nature of the hidden essence points to a correspondence between different types of knowledge, which apparently distance themselves precisely by their visibility. Transcendence, justice, and spiritual virility, heroism and asceticism dominate the teaching of Evola, the teaching of a forgotten humanity that has reached the oblivion of itself. His philosophical attitude was not inconsistent with the life of this man of a different race, and he shows this even in the last moment of his life, as he tries to stay as upright as possible in his chair, because that is how death was faced in heroic times. His last wish was, that my ashes be thrown from the height of a mountain. And so it was.